System Interference, which is this exhibition of new and recent work by Micheál O'Connell, which was developed over the past 2 years with the support of an Arts Council Commissions Award in 2020. This support enabled a period of research when Micheál spent blocks of time in residence here at Uillinn, strengthening his links with practitioners and artists locally and exploring his ideas and concerns, developing a body of work for this exhibition. Part of his work in Stupidity was to interrogate the Uillinn building itself and the area around, so that he could include site-specific elements to the exhibition. Micheál discussed these actions and other insights into his progress through a blog which he ran throughout. From Micheál's very first interaction with Uillinn, which was through an initial 2-month residency in 2019, and throughout the process ever since, Micheál has been actively participating in the cultural life of the area, interacting with the many artists who work with Uillinn through its various programs, involving local businesses in his problem solving, and encouraging discussion and participation in the ideas of his systems interference practice. From all the people that he encounters, all the staff here, the local community and the general public. So the exhibition highlights the artist's strategies of interference with everyday functional processes, including misuse, misunderstanding, lampooning and tinkering with technological systems. But there is a serious dimension in terms of environmental concerns, democracy or the lack of democracy in decision making, and what is given priority and what is not. Each element of this exhibition has been very carefully considered, and many aspects involved meticulous and lengthy research and refinement. Another element has been the production of a book with substantial text by Professor of Art and Aesthetics, the writer and philosopher John Roberts, who is here with us today, and whose writing and theorising are relevant to aspects of Micheál's practice. It has been a privilege to have him involved in the text from the beginning, involved in the project from the beginning, and enormous thanks is due to John for his perceptive and illuminating text. System Interference has also received an Arts Council Touring and Dissemination of Work Scheme Award, which will enable it to tour to Wexford Arts Centre and High Lane's Gallery Drogheda in 2023. I would like to thank Catherine Bowe, the curator of the Visual Arts programme at Wexford Arts Centre, and Aoife Ruel, director of High Lane's Gallery, who is also here, for so enthusiastically embracing this project. I also wish to thank the ongoing support of the Arts Council, Cork County Council and the Department of Social Protection, and thanks to the team here at Uillinn for their hard work and commitment: Justine, Louise, Kate, Jackie, Gavin, Claire, Claudia and Piotr, and especially Stephen Canty, who has provided huge support and been pivotal to the development of the exhibition for Uillinn in the past 2 years. Thanks also to artist Thomas Ndajce for his support of the work, and to the West Cork Arts Centre Board for their steadfast support of Micheál's work and for the ongoing work of the Centre. Above all, my sincere thanks to Micheál for being so generous in his thinking, his time and energy in the making of this exhibition, the associate programme of events and the publication. It has been such a great pleasure to work with Micheál on this project over the past number of years, and I'm really looking forward to its continuing development as the exhibition tours to other venues, contexts and communities. Now, a number of events will take place over the 6-week run of the exhibition, including a walkthrough of the show next Friday, the 23rd of September from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. This is one of a number of events here at Uillinn, taking place here at Uillinn and throughout Skibbereen and indeed the country for Culture Night. There's also a schools programme led by our public engagement artist Kate Latiroy, and if you have ever been intrigued by the local sport of road bowling, there is an opportunity to have a go on Saturday the 1st of October, Carberry Road Bowling have kindly offered to host a special introduction. And then on the 22nd of October, we will have Environment, Living Standards, Culture, when a number of local TDs, senators, public representatives from across the political spectrum will participate in a panel discussion, followed by a question and answer, and moderated by recent graduate of the MA Art and Environment, Katie Nolan. But back to today. And to mark the opening of System Interference at Uillinn, we present Stupidity, Dissent and the Machine, a gallery conversation between Micheál and writer and theorist Caroline Bassett. Caroline is Professor of Digital Humanities at Cambridge University. She researches, teaches and writes about digital media, computational humanities, technology and social power, critical theories of the digital and gender. She has recently been exploring AI writing in relation to claims for machine creativity. Her latest book, Anti-Computing, which explores histories of resistance to computerized cultures, was published earlier this year, and we are delighted to welcome Caroline to Uillinn for this event. So now I'll hand over to Micheál and to Caroline. Thank you very much.
Would people like to move in this direction so that to make a bit more space? There's some more space here. And just before Caroline and I engage in a discussion about this kind of work and about writing and the relationships, I would also like to just thank, say some thanks as well. And I won't go through the same list again, but the whole team here at Uillinn, but also Anne herself, who has been a supporter of this initiative since the first residency I did. And obviously, if you're dealing with new people, you're an unknown. You know, it takes time for that to kind of prove itself. And it was fantastic to be able to work here and to not in any way sort of drop my kind of degree of interest in kind of reasonably unconventional approaches to art practice and technology, certainly not utterly traditional. And there were no issues with that at all from the beginning to the final setup of the show. And the work's led to kind of interesting conversations in the area. And I also want to thank, I can go through the list of people here, but for the last week, Stephen Canty here, Piotr, who works with him, Tomasz and I have been setting up this show, and people have devoted themselves to it. There seemed to be a lot of excitement about the work, and that helped to kind of motivate us. A huge degree of meticulous effort went in, and attention to detail. Nuances which might not be of interest to everyone, but which were important in my view. Even that little work over there, which is simply a stamp-sized image, there were certain kind of questions about how careful we needed to be in installing that. And we were completely backed up by that. And since we installed this car outside and parked it upside down, and that led to some people enjoying it, others being critical and worried about its meaning. But we've just heard, right, that someone actually, most people are into it, others feel it's wrong in some way. So someone contacted the guards, and the guards have said, no, it's art. It's been approved by I'm not going to go through this long list of people that I can thank now, because I think we should get on with this discussion, and I can meet people individually afterwards. And many of you here have been involved with me in various ways over the last three years. So, how do you think we should start this discussion?
I'm glad we know it's art. It's a good thing to start with. I suppose, first I'd like to say thank you for inviting me, and maybe to say that we had some trouble thinking about the title of this discussion, and ended up with Stupidity, Dissent and the Machine, which was a kind of mashup of stupidity coming from Micheál and Dissent in a Machine, coming also from my work, and we were interested, I think both of us are really interested in thinking about a kind of way of relating to technological systems and also a way of relating to digital culture or technological culture, which doesn't only think about things which are immaterial, but thinks about things which are big pipes or wind turbines or road systems or transport systems. So we're both interested in trying to think about, if you like, the stakes of the kind of way we live with technology now, and how perhaps to engage with that. So I thought we might start by picking up these three terms: stupidity, and what we mean by stupidity in technology, or what you mean by it; dissent, and what we mean about responding to technological relations or technological infrastructures. If we're not happy about them, how can we do it? Is it an aesthetic thing? How does aesthetics relate to politics? And then machines. So my question to you, Micheál, might be about systems.
Yes.
So I think those three terms might be a really good place to start. I might be shouting, sorry, but I'm not sure. If you can't hear, just wave.
Can people hear back
Can you
there?
hear? Yeah, great.
If not,
So maybe if we started with stupidity, or this idea of artificial stupidity, which you've elaborated on. So I wondered whether you thought, does stupidity relate to technology, or does it relate to us using technology? Are we made stupid by machines? Or are we people having to live in a world where we're engaging with stupid technology? So how do you see stupidity? And how does it relate to this?
So to begin with, I'm sort of interested in when people use a word like art, what they're actually talking about. It's sort of often lazily thrown into conversations, but if you think about the narrative and the history, in the 60s and 70s you had the emergence of conceptual art, which now is kind of shorthand in most people's mind for pretty boring art. But I think some of it was very fantastic and very important and very interesting. And what the conceptual artists did in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere was to bring some kind of intellectual rigor to the consciously kind of intuitive processes that people romanticize, really, and to take the romance out of it, to take away the idea that something is sort of magical or can be mystified in some way. But that was 40 years ago or more. So where are we now? It seems to me that in one way all those ideas are long ago. So I think you can now be intelligent about, say, those kind of stupid behaviours in order to make a creative breakthrough, whatever that is. And that's not just an arts thing, obviously. If you're in medicine or literature or wherever, you know, creativity is something that's often spoken about. But you need to fight your knowledge and to oppose what you know and to look down on your own self and to escape those points. So I think there's a way of defending playfulness, intuition, and foolishness. So in a sense, one of the ways I've thought about this term artificial stupidity is the way that artists work and have to make themselves and are able to make fools of themselves, really, and to do things which are, in a sense, wrong, and then bring them back to the world and operate in a second way with others as well. So that's one of the many things that, but yeah.
I suppose I wondered a bit if stupidity, in terms of what you're producing, is a response to this idea that the machines we live with are cleverer and cleverer, so that there has to be some kind of response to the idea of artificial intelligence or artificial logics or even complexity, the idea that machines are black box and that we no longer can take them apart. We can't go for transparency. So if you can't aim to take something apart and understand it from the bottom up, can you then say, well, I'm going to use something that we call stupidity to see it in a different way? Is that?
I mean, Like, I mean, it's interesting because people, if you're into the idea of systems, I guess you're into making analogies and comparing one set of processes with another and saying that's quite like this. And you're also into saying, well, has anything really changed? We have now got computational technologies, but are they really different to some of the bureaucratic systems that existed historically? And are people not behaving robotically in all kinds of ways? But you seem to defend the tension or the differences as well and say, well, what is it that's special about the contemporary landscape? I mean, I've consciously, because there's been opportunity to use physical space, done less digital kind of work here and wondered about whether the road network is not similar to the information network. You know, you've got a supply chain which involves data, orders, information flowing through this vast network using something very beautiful and elegant called packet switching, and on real, which is the basis for the internet. And on real systems, especially with COVID and recent history, you've got actual packages being delivered through warehouses, distribution centres, and the two seem very like each other in some crazy way, and one seems almost like a representation of the other by accident, and so on.
I suppose I think that one of the things that interests me about this exhibition is that it plays with scale. So you have the tiny reading lamp up there, which is the cybernetic system. You put your hand underneath the sensor and you can stop the wind turbine turning. If you do it for too long, it breaks, but then you can fix it. So I'm interested as well in the relationship between cybernetic systems or computer systems, transport systems, the giant networks that are the road network, and the tiny networks which are exemplified, if you like, by that device up there. But I'm also interested in thinking about how much they're the same and how much they're different. So when you produce something which is a cybernetic network, which is a complex network which responds in a feedback-like way, in a complex way, is that an analogy for these big systems we live in? Is it a metaphor for them, or is it a representation of them? And I'm really interested in that, and I think that they're not the same, but there's a difference in scale and a difference in intervention. And so I think that difference is important in terms of what it is to interfere with those systems, actually. I don't know if that makes sense, but it seems to me interference is right in there. So when you're interfering in the technology you've got, are you doing it by replicating it, making analogies with it, making metaphors, or just living in it? And I think that might be a difference in how we approach thinking about technology.
Yeah, and I bent the stick the other way, really, in my way of thinking about the world relates to those analogies which seem inescapable. If there are self-checkout machines in a supermarket, it seems similar to an algorithmic system, or you've written about Eliza, the original interactive online therapist. Not really, but that's how people discussed it. So I do see huge connections. I mean, cybernetics is a word that's used to describe the theory of feedback loops. The idea that things feedback on themselves, and everywhere in nature, and everywhere in the human body, and everywhere in lots of mechanisms you can find these systems. But perhaps you're suggesting that we find them because we choose to try and neaten things up in that way. As humans, we're imposing a representation, and we imagine there to be this neat kind of system.
I think that ever since I think that for a couple of decades, or maybe since satellites finally encircle, the Earth more or less continuously, we're encouraged to think that we're inside a technological network which extends throughout the globe, and that is a network in which we are enmeshed. And I think that's inescapable, really. But I'm not sure that we're enmeshed in the same way all of the time, or that our relations with that enmeshing, if you like, or entanglement can't be different. So I'm interested, for example, in the fact that I can play with that little cybernetic system up there and break it, but the lights don't go out in my city. So I'm interested in the stakes And actually I'm interested because I think art can play with those stakes, partly by pointing out that they are stakes, and sometimes by refusing to point out the difference, right? So it works both ways, and that might be the game. So it's a kind of half joke. It's almost being stupid about the fact it's saying this can be a game and this can be a giant system. Let's be stupid about not recognising that they're different.
Yeah.
Because it will teach you something, or show you something, or do something. And I'm interested in that.
So, if I think about, I mean, the work here in some ways, I'm not frightened of it being sort of foolish and having built-in mechanisms, but also in a very old-fashioned way, it's very observational. And it seems strange to me that people don't consider the stakes or look at these systems in the world in the right kind of way, whatever that might be. So something like wind farms and solar farms emerge, and they're new and they're big and they're huge and they're going to save us. And sort of there's a huge kind of amount of belief in sort of these technologies, and also a lot of controversy and hostility to something new and big in particular. But something like a road system, I mean, early cars actually, there was, scare stories and people walked in front of flags because the speeds were considered to be risky. But the way the road system, car transportation, individual modes of transportation have crept up as a kind of rational thing isn't sort of questioned. I mean, road systems are astonishingly weird. I mean, when I was a boy growing up that way, we could walk on the roads for miles without worrying about traffic. It seems now to be kind of more oppressive and dangerous and inefficient as a kind of way of dealing. But that's a debate. You see, I would say my concerns in relation to a lot of this technology and systems are the lack of participation, really, the lack of a say that anyone has. Who are the designers? Who are the organisations and bureaucracies that make the decisions? And why can't we decide? Why can't we be involved in this conversation?
I agree, actually. I think don't we really at odds, but I was interested in that word you just used, which is observational.
Yeah.
So if this is an exhibition about a collection of observations, which have then been turned into objects, or objects have been found to record the observations, big objects that must have taken a while to. So that's interesting, because one thing it isn't, it seems to me, is representation. You haven't gone away and drawn them, or gone away and abstracted them. You've actually brought the things in that you have observed. And I wonder if that's because that seems to you to be a commensurate way or an important way to respond to an information system that endlessly gives us images or gives us information or virtualizes everything or invites us to live in a shiny plastic world without much weight. So is that part of what you're doing? It seems to me you've always played with collecting objects or finding objects.
Yeah, we chatted earlier about the idea of representation, modelling, simulating, depicting. So you make an image of something else, right? Whether it's imagined or sort of realistic. I guess the history of art, once again, could be seen as a kind of history from faking, which that is, it's all about illusion from the Renaissance onwards, to making, modernism, making the thing being a thing in itself that you make, and then it's not trying to point to anything else, to appropriation and taking, which is not obviously an original idea. Marcel Duchamp's gesture, or Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven's gesture was over 100 years ago, right? So these, Douglas Hubler, 50 years ago, said, the world is full of stuff more or less interesting I do not wish to kind of add to it. So I think it's impossible nowadays to be fundamentalist like the modernists were, but I like the idea of engaging with some sort of principles that you might not be able to completely adhere to, and one of those, for me, is trying not to make anything, which possibly fits with environmental concerns, but maybe not. Maybe it's just maybe the propensity we have to make is pushed at us and sort of hard to escape. So if you walk around Skibbereen, you find Barry Brothers who sell these pipes. Joanne here works as a sewerage specialist and gave me, so I've done lots of investigating, found what I could. We've got a car outside, and the inflatable turbines upstairs, I just had this idea that that's a funny thing, an inflatable wind turbine. And the toy wind turbine. So there's this infrastructure of plastic and supply chains and cod kind of materials that's wasteful and silly, connected with environmentalism as well. So I couldn't. So I wondered whether I could get an inflatable wind turbine without making one. Everyone I spoke to suggested means of making them. I considered using the toys as a template, and maybe I could minimise the amount of effort I put in physical effort or having to learn some craft skill and stitch some silly materials together. And eventually I found a firm which was called Earthmill. They're a wind turbine maintenance company, and they had made one to promote their business. So I rang them up and I said, can I borrow this? I don't want to make one myself, can I? And they said no. They must have looked at my site and not given me this one. So I've been sending them an email since, operating as if we're actually partnering, and they're just go away. But I found the company that supplied them, and I got 2 identical ones made. So I did, produce something, but not. I was trying to cut that down. So I'm interested in kind of pushing back against the idea of making as well. But your question was.
I think I'm interested in whether the kind of strategies or tactics, if you like, that you're using in putting on this show or developing this work might be, if you like, the only or amongst the few possible ways to engage with technological systems we live in, because it's really hard. It's really hard to engage with technology that is already ubiquitous, that's already become invisible, that gives it to us as the shiny front and tends to avoid the infrastructure underneath, or that wants to be renewed. So one of the things I'm interested in is this endless way in which we're meant to seamlessly upgrade our technology and forget we had an earlier version, or forget that we had a surveillance crisis in the 70s, 60s, 50s, or a leisure and work crisis in the 60s. So there's this idea that in order to have any kind of response, a critical response, if you like, to the technologies we live in, we have to find new ways to do it, or particular ways or strategies, and simply representing is not enough, and we can't open the boxes and take things apart. So we have to find a commensurate way to do this stuff. But it's also interesting then that, to me it was interesting that all the little wind turbines up there, you've opened the boxes, but I still don't know how they work. So in some ways technology closes itself off even while it opens itself up, and I think that's new. I think that's one of the things that is new about AI and machine learning, and I think it's that kind of cognitive complexity.
Yeah, you refer in your book, Anti-Computing, to even your own car, which is not new. It has kind of mysterious automatic things happening, and now people's vehicles are sort of mysterious in so many ways.
I think some of that is a sleight of hand or a way of thinking about it. It interests me that people, I've done quite a lot of work on electric vehicles, I'm interested in them, and it interests me that people talk about cars as already almost like computers, and of course they're not. There's half a ton of car turned upside down there. So it may have central locking, it may have a system we can't get into to fix it anymore, but to talk about that as a computational object, or even the new kinds of cars we might get, AI-driven cars, are still going to be material objects that are largely mechanical as well as computational. So I'm interested in thinking about the different systems that overlap and the possibilities of opening them up or encountering them when they're locked away from us so much of the time.
There seems to be 2 tendencies. One is to become overly excited by new technologies or systems, West Coast USA style, and the other is to be nostalgic and sort of irrationally fetishizing yesterday's media. And I'm personally also wondering about the way people work with the tools that Apple or Adobe or whoever give, say, digital artists and likewise in other realms. It's extremely limiting, and the kind of creativity isn't yours in a way. I mean, if you use the Solarize filter in Photoshop, that doesn't make you kind of Man Ray or and there's something very strange about people's embracing of this thing. I think it's quite like a religion, on top of hills and mountains in Ireland, it was common to have a crucifix, and they still exist. There's one on top of Caroline that's been reinstalled. But now you've got the kind of these huge epic kind of entities, these wind turbines, which once again might be fantastic, or it's not that easy to kind of determine really, but people treat technological and scientific breakthroughs as a kind of religion as well.
And also as replacement, so I looked at the tiny turbine on top of the cafe, and then I looked at it from the top. And actually, it's interesting because from that roof up there, you can see your tiny outer scale wind turbine. You can also see a weather vane, a clock, a church clock, a satellite dish, 1,000 different decades of television aerial, and multiple other masts whose function I have no idea about, but I understand them to be part of the complex technological infrastructure that is this place, which you've intervened in or interfered in a way that makes us think about them again. Because I hadn't looked out through that window, and I don't think if I'd looked out through that window without that little wind turbine being there, I don't think I'd have counted the masts and the areas. I did. I counted 25 things that stick up, 25 verticals. So I think there's something about I'm interested in both the specificity of the new and how it inserts itself as exceptional, and also how it is embedded in a longer history, which is also a technological history, because all of those verticals are technology. And I think that is something that you're both engaging with and letting us play with when you put in pipes at this scale and wind turbines at this scale and link the inside and the outside of the exhibition. And I actually think it's really interesting. I suppose it might...
Yeah, I did want the exhibition to sort of bleed beyond the space, so there are QR codes, and I'm getting sick of QR codes. I mean, Jonathan and I have had many discussions about QR codes and how it's taken so long for them to gain traction. They were around for a long time, and suddenly they're everywhere. So I made some big ones, but that links to other activities that go beyond this exhibition. Putting the plinth on the roof and the car in the front is sort of partly about that too. Locating Loading Bay as a beach in Skibbereen on Google Maps, and the traffic jam as a tourist attraction. That kind of stuff that goes beyond the space. And simultaneously, just talking about there's a history as well of institutional critique of sort of being hostile to artistic institutions. Very important history. And maybe the only thing in this show that does that is this, which kind of you can throw a ball at the wall. But possibly there's also a need to defend institutions and think differently about which not say all institutions are the same. An arms company is not the same as an art gallery. Maybe it's better to pick better enemies, really, or play more complex games.
Perhaps we have to think about when we think about a technological landscape, it's tempting to think in terms of scale, the large and the small, the near and the far, or to think of it in terms of generations of technology or increasingly but actually the big division, which I think is the one we're often invited to forget, would be the division about power. Who are the powerful organisations that are shaping this stuff, and what are the powerful institutions that want the technology we have to go in a particular way? And I agree with you. I think one of the functions of of art institutions is to disrupt that, or coming back to this term again, interfere with it actually. Because if the art institutions aren't doing that, it's not clear to you who is, really, or isn't amongst those people dissenting, if you like. But that might take us really from stupidity to dissent, or this notion of dissent. So I'd be interested to think about how interference relates to that. In my book on anti-computing, I defined it as something about, it's a cultural history of people who might have refused, rejected, looked askance, stood back from, interfered with, were hostile to, intervened in, or simply didn't like the particular technology they were faced with, and did something about it. So I wonder how interference fits into that. And also, if you like, what the difference between interference by way of a show like this, what the difference is between that and maybe a kind of politics of the hack, or a politics of direct engagement, or so how do you see interference?
I mean, I've heard you speak and read your other texts and some of anti-computing, and what's satisfying about that approach that you take is that it's not, it's in a kind of an account of the dissent which existed over a period of time, and it's discussions about the discussions as well. So rather than taking a kind of binary yes-no, or your book Anti-Computing isn't anti-computing, really. It's about the history of questioning of technology, and I'm interested in a kind of third way of dealing with these things, rather than simply looking at the pluses and minuses and approaching it that way. But the word dissent is a very important word. Marcel Duchamp talked about dissent as a very important characteristic for those who engage with what's called art. I guess, what does it mean? People, surely it has to be a kind of a minority. You know, if everyone was in a state of kind of dissent, what would that lead to? I don't know. But I think the term is kind of crucial. And then the difference between, say, a word like interference and a word like hacking, or direct action and political action is important as well. And perhaps there's something important and valuable about staying beneath the radar and not letting something become instrumentalized, too full of messages, like a manifesto or a propaganda piece, which can be fantastic. I mean, there are great John Hartfield's montages. There's some fantastic kind of history of that in it. But I'm more keen on the idea of pulling back, which also means you don't get in trouble. It's secondly because I value political action, and I think it's not to be done lightly. Any old action won't do, you know. So how do things actually change? Probably not through artistic presentations, but maybe they play a role somehow in the mix.
I think one of the things I was interested in doing is thinking about the relationship between kind of organised political dissent and the ways that people live with technology. And often that's thought about as, on the one hand, domestication. We reconcile ourselves to it and come to like it. That's the story we're told. And the other is dissent against the machine, which in relation to computational systems, at least, has been a resounding failure, we'd have to say. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you take the years since 1945, if you begin in 45 with cybernetics and Norbert Wiener at the beginning of modern computing, there's been, every decade, there's been people arguing against a particular advance in machine or expansion of the area in which machines are coming to organise our lives. And in each case, the expansion has happened. You know, there were people against the expansion of social media, millions. There's people against. So, in some ways, any campaign or any movement to restrict the technological has always been a massive failure. On the other hand, the ways that people have come to live with the technologies they use is an area that's much more complicated hasn't involved simply a kind of lying down and being organised, if you like. So I'm interested in thinking about those forms of living with technology that weren't about eventual acceptance, but are actually much more nuanced and patterned and have more resistance, if you like, in the warp and the weft, if that's a way of putting it. So it's something about thinking about how histories of technology tell us how the story that the computer companies tell us about development isn't as smooth as all that. There's always been glitches and moves back and changes and adaptations. And some of them have come from interference.
So do you think there's a bottom-up thing as well, that people intuitively, inappropriately use things or use the tools that are given to them in ways that weren't predicted by the corporations?
But I also don't think that what that produces is better technology. I think that's completely, there's a sort of myth that says, that one of the big myths is no one thought about text messages until the public got hold of the phone, and then they discovered there was text messages and we had a social media revolution. I don't think that what people do with technology reveals to us the best that technology can be. But I do think people do things with technology and with technological systems and with infrastructures that's surprising and not quite expected and constitutes a patterned response, and there's not a single response. Which would also get at, actually, the idea there isn't a single response anyway, because we tend to be, we're advised, if you like, or heavily promoted. There's a heavy promotion of the notion that we live in with technology in the same way, and of course we don't. It's global, but our experience of it is profoundly different depending on where we come from and the kind of access we have.
Yeah, I guess at the end of John's book, he talks about comedy and sort of the way that you can play with these things and fool around, possibly just offering moments of respite, really. So we are living in this world right now, and if we have a completely negative kind of understanding of what it is, then that doesn't seem too useful. Perhaps you can still have fun with it and maybe over-embrace the things that everyone's complaining about. If there are surveillance cameras everywhere, you kind of look at them, and there's a Chinese artist actually who sat on top of some steps and looked straight into a security camera and just waited to see, and he was there for 48 hours or something before the security people came and took him away. And he didn't end up in too bad a place. But I quite enjoyed that idea that when people are warning and complaining about kind of overuse, just kind of going with it, really, or pretending you're a car when you're not, going down the street, or it's so childish. And I worked for 6 or 7 years with a professional clown and set up scenarios for him to operate in with technology quite often, and I think it's a very valuable coping mechanism, and that's not good enough, obviously, if you're interested in the bigger political questions, but it's something you can do simultaneously.
It's also true that I think the point of commonality here would be that technology isn't, my take on computational technology is not anyway that it's bad. It's, that phrase, it's neither good nor bad nor neutral, seems to me problematic as well,
right,
and sort of difficult. But it doesn't. It seems to me that we co-evolved with technology, we're technological beings, and that there are ways to think with technology and through technology. And the point really is not to excoriate the technological in favour of this thing called the cultural, which is almost impossible to envisage as non-technological. Technology is culture, perhaps that's really obvious. But the thing that follows from that is that there's ways to engage with technological developments that are interesting and creative, and so that the most boring thing about the discussions around AI and general intelligence and AI agents and AI writing at the moment is that everybody's obsessed with asking, can these AI agents be creative? The creative is a human term. The interesting thing is what they might do that is post-human, if you like, not because they're conscious, but because it's a different kind of cognitive production. So there's all kinds of ways that technology is to be played with and to be an element of complexity in the world that's to be thought through and welcome, which changes our perception of the way that we can take hold of the world, that I think is not at all negative. So my take on anti-computing is not that one should be anti-it. I probably should change the title ages ago.
Yeah, there's a fixation on the singularity, that moment when technology will sort of take over and make us redundant. There's, whether machines can be creative, which once again is hardly a new question. I mean, Ada Lovelace was posing these questions in the early 19th century when she saw that Jacquard Loon, Byron's daughter. But also, the point I made about the Man-Ray filter, or whatever, applies. And if you think about computers being creative, even the surrealists had lots of tricks for employing randomness. If I throw some sheets of paper on the floor and they land in a particular way, that's a way of it seeming intelligent and outside my own abilities. I can either make myself stupid in order to make a creative breakthrough or do silly things, and those can lead to very interesting results. So in a sense, computers being creative is no different than that very simple system of throwing some things on the floor and seeing where they land. And these bowling balls here, or bowls, keep getting kicked, and I think when Thomas and I were setting them up, we kind of imagined that might start to happen, and it has, and it's not quite clear. So it seems to have a life of its own, an intelligence of its own. And once again, I am sort of making analogies and thinking, is it really new? If we imagine ourselves to be in some sort of bureaucratic algorithmic system, it's the same kind of language that's used in software development: code, procedure, process, and so on. Those terms existed before computing and exist beyond it. So a list of instructions. I mean, I was up at the I went to the Famine Museum, and there was this code that was introduced during the famine period, where people would be offered relief in the mid-19th century if they would give up their property, their small property. And what often happened is that they left their property, were evicted, and were not then given a piece of paper to prove that, and died of starvation. So these people would turn up to the poorhouse, and people would say, no, you must get rid of your property first, otherwise we can't feed you. They were behaving like robots. They were just, and it was leading to very material kind of results. So I think these kind of coded systems, which emerge naturally sometimes, but are often expected, are very, very, very similar in a way. But I think, your shtick is probably it's also different.
Well, I think it's accelerated. Yeah. So if you go back to the 1960s, there was an anti-computing campaign in Britain, which was really interesting because there were 5,000 computers at the time in Britain, more or less, and there were 5,000 members of the anti-computing campaign. So for 1 year it was sort of victorious, I suppose, before falling into total obscurity. But I do think, and that campaign in Britain was part of a big interest globally, actually, around the world in different ways in the idea of a computer revolution. And one of the things people were interested in was whether computation would make machines of us. So would these systems that were amplifying the use of codes turn us into pieces of code? And I suppose an analogy with today would be people in call centres who have to use scripts. So people you talk to in interactions with your bank or something, and you don't know if they're a bot or a human, because the human has to use the same script as the bot, right? So the only way you can break it is to get context. You have to ask the difficult questions. So I think if there's a difference, or if there's something that's changing, I think it might be to do with the increasing influence of the demand for a codification on humans. That's the kind of threat, is that we adapt our behaviour so that we fit into the technological systems we're given. And that is actually not a new threat either. So going back to the time of the anti-computing moment, Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, talked about an accelerated form of behaviourism which would produce a world in which there was no more conditioning. So we're part of the system, but we have no way to become a cog or a gear that can break or be interfered with. So I think that that idea that we're increasingly part of a system, but not only that, but the logics of the system are machine logics, not human logics, is accelerating. And I think that might be what you're interfering with right here. Saying actually there's ways that those systems aren't smooth and they're not closed, and that you're messing with scale, you're messing with what's open and what's closed, you're messing with what's a toy and what's serious. So in all those ways you're kind of saying this looks like a system that we're all in, and it's cybernetic and we're part of it, and it scales all the way down and all the way up. But actually as soon as you put it in a gallery, you've interfered. As soon as you point out the discrepancy in scale, you've sort of interfered. So that's kind of my take on it. I do think behaviourism is the biggest threat, if you like. Behaviourism is this idea that it's all right to be conditioned. It's all right to be nudged. It's all right to be nudged, not only about things you don't care about, but nudged about your politics, so that you consent to having no consent. You consent to not thinking about consent.
Well, my daughter Betty and I were in a supermarket, and the person at the self-checkout, or at the checkout machine, old school, asked, "How was your day?" And she pointed out that she had a list written up behind, and that was one of the questions they had to ask. And then managers went through to check that they asked that question as well. I don't think Fields and Skibbering has gone to those extremes yet. It's very authentic, kind of friendly kind of communications. But these are really important and interesting questions. The degree, Hannah Arendt, in her Origins of Totalitarianism, also speaks about bureaucracy, specifically as a characteristic, an invention of empires, the British Empire and other European empires. And I also associated with Stalinistic Russia as the key kind of characteristic of Stalinism and similar regimes was extreme bureaucracy, as an opposite, in fact, to democracy. So I think the more bureaucracy there is, that's a sign probably that people are not involved in human participatory conversations and activities. So,
which is partly what people mean, I guess, when they talk about technocratic rationality, or the expansion of technocratic rationality or living by bureaucratic systems. And it always interested me about Hannah Arendt is known for a book about the human condition, which is about a society where labour is ending. That's how she talked about it. But actually, I think it's a book about technology. So even from the 1960s, she's talking about the expansion of bureaucratic systems and forms of life. And the connection with bureaucracy is a connection between systems that closed systems.
So her thinking is very prophetic and so on. In John's book, he gives a lot of attention to the idea of being shamed in relation to intelligent technologies as well. Maybe we should kind of have a wrap up and have some questions if people want to do that. But I just want to say something as well, in terms of this work and how it emerges, because there's a few things happening simultaneously, and I don't think, personally, I hadn't, and I doubt many do, gone out with the intention of exposing these kinds of problems necessarily. I think work and so on can be resolved and complete without being, without stating something in a clear, messaged way. If somebody wants to explain this, that's not necessarily my job. It might be operating in a more nuanced or complicated way than that. It might be a form of communication, but not easy communication. I think complicated ways of communicating might be preferable in some ways to kind of plain speaking, actually. Do you think we should sort of wind this up, or should we
I think we
continue?
should agree that stupidity is complex.
Yeah.
I think we should open it to questions, but I think as well that it's really great. I mean, we should say that actually. It's a really fantastic exhibition that's going to make people think. So thank you for
Thank you for coming along, and I am satisfied with it myself.